We'll be back from the break and we continue with business today. Well, tonight in the coffee court, we take a look at the private sector. How has it been faring since 1962? Mentioning 1962 because this is the Independence Week. And speaking the Independence Week in 1962, on the 9th of October, Uganda got her independence. Now on Sunday, we shall be marking 60 years of self-rule, or that freedom that you would wish for. Well, here in the Coffee Court tonight, Fred Makubia brings to you the private sector situation to understand more, with an insightful discussion with the Private Sector Foundation of Uganda to see how the private sector members have been performing and how has the sector been since 1962.
60 years of independence. We discuss the journey of Uganda. Where have we come from? Where are we? And where are we headed? And welcome to this coffee court. My name is Fred Makubia. This is where we discuss the critical questions. This time around, we digest the journey of the Private Sector Foundation since 1994. Where did they start from? Where are they right now? And what are their projections? Joining me is Mr. Francis Kisirinya. He's in charge of membership here at the Private Sector Foundation Uganda. Mr. Francis, thank you for joining us on this coffee court where we ask the critical questions.
Thank you very much, and our viewers over there. The story of independence and PSFU, I must say that for us, we were not there as Private Sector Foundation at the time of independence, but we emerged from the setup of our economy at independence and what it is now. Those of you who may recall, our economy in the 60s at independence was largely government-driven economy. Most government used to do business a lot. You would hear so many companies that are government-owned, so many companies that the government had made an investment.
Okay.
And this is government that was doing business. So it was investing in a number of companies through Uganda Development Corporation of that time. So there were so many, if you hear all those, like for instance, the whole hotel industry was a government, all of them were owned by government.
Okay.
So many companies in manufacturing, government had shares there and controlled them. Now, what happened, this kind of economy took us to some level. And of course, it developed us as a country for the time was, as you know.
Okay.
But as you know, in 1990, the government decided now to make reforms in the economy, and it came up with the liberalization policy, where whoever was able to trade, whether government, whether the private sector, could actually trade freely. No advantages that because I'm a government company, I'm going to have very special treatment in the market. Now, so government proclaimed that liberalization policy, and it made the private sector the engine of the economy.
Okay.
Now, what that meant is that government had to really get itself out of business. That is when now you now had the privatization policy taking shape, and it was implemented for the purpose of ensuring that now that the policy has changed, you now have a private sector-led economy. Therefore, people who should be doing businesses should be private sector controlled.
So you are not government?
And owned. No, we are not government.
Okay.
So now, because of that, there emerged a gap, because now you used all businesses and companies, most of them were government. Now you've changed these. Now they are private sector.
Okay.
Led. Now government remained on policy making. Now a gap emerged in the early 90s, where government would like, it wasn't trading anymore. It was the private sector trading. Government was doing policy, and it is businesses operate according to the policies that are being provided. Now, there was a gap, so nobody would engage with the government directly on issues that affect the private sector. If I'm an individual company and I have an issue, I'll go to government and say, I have this kind of problem. But nobody knows whether that problem is for you alone or it is for the entire private sector. So that gap emerged, and there was a need now to create an organization which would represent all the private sector, bring them together, understand what the issues are about, research about them, engage and create what we call policy positions that are owned by the entire private sector, and then move to government and say, as far as the private sector is concerned, on this law, this is how we would like it to be changed. And if you change it like this, it will help us. So private sector was formed in 1995 because of that. So it is not a government agency, it is a private sector institution.
So how were you able to do business with all the gap between the private sector and government then?
Now, before independence, and immediately after independence, before 1990, when the policies changed to liberalization, as I mentioned, government used to trade, used to do policy. It was one and the same thing. So government would decide what would be good for itself. That's why you would hear they were setting prices for the goods that they were selling. The reason is that they had both powers. They had powers to set policies or to set laws, but they also were trading. So now today in a liberal policy, you don't, as private sector, you don't have power to set a policy for a national policy or a national price for anything. No, you can only set a price for your own good, your own product. And another one sets for their own product like that. But you cannot have one price because the powers are different.
So in terms of GDP, tax matters related to taxes, how were the things happening then? I'm talking about then.
Still, we had the GDP. Those of you who remember, I think by independence, our GDP was anywhere below $1 billion US dollars. By 1986, this had moved up to about $5 billion, you know? So we had industry here. We had our economy was mainly, our GDP was mainly driven by three things, if you remember. There was the 3 C's, what we call 3 C's, which is copper, coffee, cotton. This is what the economy was running on, really. And these were the ones that were contributing to the GDP. There was also some manufacturing, not very, the contribution was not so big. It was mainly, contribution was mainly from mining, was from agriculture. So manufacturing, yes, we had some companies that were manufacturing in ginger, producing beer, producing clothes, producing a number of items. And actually, if you remember, like some clothes were named after ginger. Those of you who would wear school uniform those days, there is a material which they used to call ginger. And it is from this material that school uniforms were being made. So there was manufacturing. But now, when the policy was changed in the 90s, and we made sure that the economy was driven by the private sector, we are going to have an open economy where market forces determine everything. There is free entry, whoever wants to trade.
And free exit. And
free exit comes and trades. Remember, before it was government court, government would decide whether you're going to trade or not. Right now, the government's role is to regulate, just say, okay, go and register your business, or if you may not even register, but you can continue trading. So there is no problem. So now, because of that, so many companies came up and started doing business in Uganda. So that's why now you have seen the economy has really transformed.
So in terms of membership, since this is your docket, what was the kind of membership? How many members did you have then?
So in 1995, when we began with just 11 members. And those
in terms of association?
The associations.
Okay.
They were just 11. But that showed also the size of the economy. the sectors were just not so many of them, not very many. So we almost had all of them at the beginning, 1995. It is not surprising that we didn't have at the beginning people who were in the ICTs, in the telecommunication, and stuff because they were not there. But because of the liberalization policy that came through, we have seen a lot of investments that have come. So today the economy has changed significantly. Like for instance, now manufacturing contributes a higher portion of GDP than even agriculture.
So, Mr. Idibi, maybe before we come to the current situation, so how are you thriving as the private sector? Because you're not government, so how are you surviving in terms of finances, in terms of many other things?
Yes, we are not government, but we do a lot of business for government. As I mentioned to you, we engage government so that government can do policies for the private sector that work for them. But also government has given us a mandate and has given us a task to implement those things we think are a problem to the private sector. Invest, intervene, and make sure they improve. So government gives us, extends to us projects like, for instance, from the World Bank, from the European Union, as long as they are going to intervene and help in improving the business environment. Like, for instance, we have so many challenges in land registry, in business registration, in tourism, skilling, for instance. So government says, okay, we have got this money, go and do it. You better understand your private sector. Go and do what the private sector needs.
So you have the powers now.
So now, from those resources, that is what actually funds us as PSFU. In addition to that, our members contribute also some money which actually helps us run this institution.
And then that brings us to the 60 years of independence. So now 60 years of independence. Are you in charge of the private sector, first and foremost?
Yes, as the private sector
with all the current situations,
yes,
inflation and many of those, which you should be able actually to do. Are you in charge of the private sector?
Yes, as private sector foundation, one, we can't say we're in charge, because government is the one that has power.
Or maybe are you the driving force?
On a number, yes, we're driving force as private sector in Uganda's economy today. I can tell you, if you look at the contribution of taxes to government, all of it is coming from the private sector. There is just very few companies that are government-owned which contribute taxes. Over 98% of taxes come from private sector companies. Secondly, if you look at employment, over possibly around 90% come from the private sector. Government employs few people. It's mostly coming from the private sector. If you look at the exports, the money we get from exports, private sector almost brings in all the money that comes from exports. Exporting industrial goods, it is the private sector. Exporting agricultural goods, the primary products like coffee, like a cotton, like flowers, horticulture products, fish, all of that work is done by the private sector. So private sector is really the one that is driving this economy in Uganda.
But the things you're talking about, issues of coffee and cotton, these are now a dream to Uganda.
No, they are not a dream to Uganda, not at all. The only problem that we have not actually resolved, and is an element that drove, one of the things that drove Uganda to independence. There are many things, but one of them was that economic emancipation, where you would see people participating in your economy and benefiting more from them. You know, the parties, the activism that brought about the parties that brought us independence actually came from agitation for Ugandans to also sell cotton, to sell coffee, and not Indians alone. That was the beginning of the activism that brought the Uganda National Congress of Musazi, which evolved and combined with Obote to come to have UPC. You know, this came from that. So even today, what we have not yet achieved, and it is work in progress, is that economic emancipation, because we are getting not only the value that we should get from our agriculture products and minerals. So
60 years of independence, inflation is high. Bank of Uganda is doing its best by increasing the CBR. Prices are going high. You basically know what is happening in the country.
It continues to underline the message that I've just delivered, and the common person feels like, am I really independent?
And that's the propelling reason why I ask whether you are in charge.
If I'm really paying so much for the goods and services. Yes, the fact that we are paying so much for the goods and services doesn't mean that we are not independent. No,
Sure.
we are independent, but the challenge, as I mentioned, is how to manage and drive our economy so that it benefits all of us.
Then what is independence? In this context, in the context of the subject?
Now, in the context of a common person, independence, to me, I would believe, is the ability for you to self-determine. How do I self-determine? Because I have the money, I can determine where my child goes to school. I can determine where I can go for health services. I can determine what kind of meal I can have. But because of minimum or modest economic means, you can see that a common person does not have all that power to self-determine on that. Even on the government side, also self-determination is a bit compromised because we don't have all the resources we need to drive our agenda. So sometimes we have to ask donors to really work with us on certain things. And they come with some of their conditionalities, which conditionalities kind of like hamper or undermine what somebody can call self-determination.
Okay.
So it is work in progress, and we definitely, as a country, have a long journey to go. But the game changer, the way to deal with this is to understand very clearly that how do we better optimize, how do we better use the resources we have to improve our economic well-being. And the game is in value addition and value retention. What do I mean by value addition and value retention? If you are, for instance, we produce a lot of coffee in this country. Now, we should struggle as much as possible as a country to see that coffee, if a kilo of coffee with all the products and sub-products that come out of it, perhaps can generate $30.
That will be good for it. Will be good for us as a country.
For us to ensure that we climb this value chain, and of the $30, probably capture the majority of that money, maybe $20. There you are getting much of the value addition. Today, from the coffee we have, from the $30, we capture like less than $2.
So, Mr. Idi, moving...
So meaning that you cannot have economic emancipation if you are continuing like that. The second thing is that even when you create the value, make sure that you retain more of that value as a country. It means you must have more participation by citizens in these economic activities so that when the distribution of the value created is done, most of that value addition remains with us.
I would think these are things you should be pushing as a private sector.
Yes.
That's my thinking.
For us as private sector, we've done this, and you know very well that in 2007, we began a program here called Proudly Ugandan. And we ran it as private sector foundation because we knew that you cannot capture more value and retain more value from what you do if you don't add value and if you don't actually buy the things that are made in here. So we used to have a lot of importation from abroad here. You make the money here the hard way, but then the goods you buy are goods that are manufactured elsewhere. So the biggest value goes away. So to retain this value, we said no. We'll produce these goods in Uganda, but also consume them as Uganda. So that's why we created the Proudly Ugandan campaign in 2007.
Okay.
And the motivated government, now it has turned into what they call Buy Uganda, Build Uganda. It is a government policy, which is now evolving into local content. Now, the local content law and policies that have been put together are definitely achieving those two things that I've talked about.
60.
Increase value, share more of the value. When that happens, we will have a more emancipated, independent country.
6 years of independence. What is it that we must learn, relearn, and unlearn?
From the economic side, one lesson that we have to learn very clearly is that we have to let the private sector operate unencumbered, regulate, but don't control it. Don't set up prices for it. No. Let the market forces drive the economy here. Every time you try to change things as government, you distort, and then the economy gets into confusion.
Okay.
So that is a big lesson that we must learn. Now, in terms of going forward, you know, what exactly should we? The other lesson that we must do, we must change, as I said, exporting primary products must change. We must ensure that we export value-added products. We must export manufactured products, products on which we've added value. That is something that we must do and move forward on that.
We must be winding up, Mr. Francis Kisirinya.
Yes.
Your parting shots.
Yeah, fellow Ugandans, I really want to congratulate you upon these 60 years. I think in Uganda, when you reach 60 and you've been employed, I think many companies or government will ask you to retire. But for a country, this is a prime age. It is a prime age. Therefore, at 60 years and going forward, we definitely must do a number of things differently. I've mentioned the things that we must protect as a country. Let us make sure that we never go back to instability. Security is a very important thing for the economy. The second thing on the economics, let us continue pursuing a private sector-led economy. The private sector foundation in Uganda must continue to be there with the private sector institutions, companies doing their work without interference. The third thing that must happen, we must continue adding value to our products and seek out export markets. Because our market is small, it cannot actually drive and take up all the goods and services we are producing.
Mr. Francis Kisirinya, thank you for speaking and sharing that wonderful backgrounded knowledge. You've heard of a quote that says many people celebrate in years and yet they've never had life in years. I hope as a country this will not be just a mere celebration, but it will be a fundamental celebration. That is it from the Private Sector Foundation. Mr. Francis Kisirinya is in charge of membership here at the Private Sector Foundation. This is the Coffee Court. My name is Fred Makubuya.
Thank you very much for being part of Business Today, wherever you've been catching us from. And I'm Jerome Paul Sonko with Winnie Wiz and Akauchi on Sign Language. Have a blessed night. Till tomorrow, good night.